But that was a common warning, though, in the 1990s against unipolarity, because, well, they said it would do two things. One, it would exhaust the resources of the United States and the political West, but it would also incentivize other rising powers to collectively balance the West, because in the unipolar order, in order to be only one center of power, it makes sense to contain all other regional powers. But in a multipolar system, it only encourages collective balancing. So, for example, encouraging India to not trade with Iran just means that Iranians will be more dependent on China. In, I think it was 2012, we had Hillary Clinton arguing that the US should slow down or try to break up the Eurasian Economic Union because it institutionalized too much Russian influence over Central Asia. It was also cited as a reason, well, by many as a reason why toppling the government in Ukraine in 2014 became a key objective. But if Russia doesn't have influence in Central Asia, then China's influence will grow out of proportion. So the whole idea of having the system working towards a natural equilibrium appears to be undermined. I mean, even in Europe, why would it seems once you shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, having Germany and France have better relations with Russia would be preferable, wouldn't it, than having now, as we see now with the SEO agreements being made, all this gas which was supposed to fuel Europe instead going to China. So Russia also becomes more dependent on China. It just seems that some of this should be common sense, but we're not really doing anything towards this end. But do you think Trump appreciates that it is a multipolar system? Because he recently now tweeted out that Russia and India has been lost to China, but the whole point of the Russians and Indians isn't that they want to align under Chinese leadership to go against America. They see China as being the main partner to work towards a multipolar system where they're independent centers of power, but nobody wants to join a Chinese bloc. I mean, against America. I think they're more, instead of going against America, they want to go against American hegemony. But that's two very different things. So do you think Trump sees the world as being bipolar then? Because I have a hard time making sense of some of these decisions being made.
Before I answer that question, Glenn, let me just make one quick comment on what you said about our policies, American policies or Western policies during unipolarity and what they mean for the multipolar world we're now in. I think the best example of a foolish policy during unipolarity that's come back to bite us in multipolarity is NATO expansion, especially NATO expansion into Ukraine. As you know very, very well, in April 2008, we made the decision, the West made the decision, NATO made the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO. And we've doubled down on that decision at every point since then. And the consequences here are just disastrous for all concerned, as you were pointing out. But we had a great deal of hubris during the unipolar moment. And this is more true of the United States than it was of the Europeans. But the Europeans were willing to go along with the United States. And this was especially true of the British. And we collectively thought that we could run the world, that we had the wind at our back. And if other countries didn't like it, we would just shove things down their throat. This is how we approach NATO expansion. We understood from the get-go that the Russians were opposed to NATO expansion. But in 1999, we shoved it down their throat. In 2004, we shoved the second big tranche down their throat. And then we thought we could shove the third big tranche, which would include Ukraine and Georgia, down their throat in April of 2008. And of course, it didn't work out, and it is made for a terrible situation. One could argue a catastrophic situation in Europe in the multipolar era. But I just wanted to sort of add to what you said. All right, on Trump, a very interesting question. You want to remember, When Trump comes into office, this is January 2017, his administration, in the very first year they are in power, introduces the word multipolarity into the national security dialogue in the United States. The word multipolarity is not present in the Obama administration. It's President Trump who talks about multipolarity, and they talk about the Chinese and the Russians as the other two great powers. Furthermore, Trump, when he comes into office, abandons engagement with China, which was a very liberal policy designed to make China rich and turn it into a liberal democracy on the assumption we would all live happily ever after. It's Trump who ends engagement and adopts containment in this multipolar world, as his administration describes it. Furthermore, as you remember, Trump wanted to have good relations with Russia, with Putin. And if he had succeeded at that, and we had had no NATO expansion into Ukraine, the United States and Russia would have much better relations today than exists. Now, what happened? What happened is that as a result of Russiagate and the power of the deep state, Trump ended up being every bit as antagonistic towards the Russians as his predecessors and his successors. And as we all know, he was the first president to provide offensive arms to the Ukrainians. So what happened with the coming of President Trump to the White House in January 2017 is that we, in a very conspicuous way, moved into a multipolar world, number one. Number two, we put a great deal of emphasis on containing China and abandoning engagement. But with regard to Russia, we continued to push the Ukraine situation to the point where it was guaranteed that the Russians were going to end up allied with the Chinese, which didn't make any sense. So that's the first Trump administration. Then we get the second Trump administration, which of course starts on January 20th of this year. We're clearly in a multipolar world now. There's just no doubt about that. Trump is interested in containing China, apparently. And it looks like he's interested in improving relations with Putin and with Russia more generally. He looks like in the beginning that he's interested in doing in his second administration vis-a-vis Russia what he was unable to do in his first administration. But it doesn't work. He does it in such a ham-fisted way that he makes virtually no progress in settling the Ukraine war, and relations between the United States and Russia, despite appearing better on the surface, are pretty much the same as ever. The Russians don't trust us at all. The Russians are clearly closely allied with the Chinese, and they understand full well that they should remain closely allied with the Chinese. Because the problem with President Trump is that he changes his mind every other day, and you can't trust him. The Indians found that out, as we discussed earlier. The Russians have found that out on countless occasions. They talk to him, they think they have an agreement, and then a couple days later, Trump changes his mind. So the end result of all this is that the Russians and the Chinese, as we were saying before, are as close together as ever. The Indians are now reasonably close to both the Russians and the Chinese because of Trump's foolish policies. So in a very important way, Trump has good instincts, I think. You know, in terms of his basic instincts on the nature of international politics and what our relationship should be with countries like Russia and China. Again, I think his basic instincts are correct. But in terms of execution, he gets a failing grade. And that's why the United States is in so much trouble today.